Welcome back to the Everything is Energy channel, the KYBALION book read, part 9. We're reading page 81, the end of 80, and page 81, causation, chapter 12. The ancient writers expressed the matter thus: the further the creations is from the center, the more it is bound. The nearer the center it reaches, the nearer free is it. The majority of people are more or less the slaves of heredity, environment, etc., and manifest very little freedom. They are swayed by the opinions, customs, and thoughts of the outside world, and also by their emotions, feelings, moods, etc. They manifest no mastery worthy of the name. They indignantly repudiate this assertion, saying, "Why? I certainly am free to act and do as I please. I do just what I want to do." But they fail to explain hence arise the want to and as I please. What makes them want to do one thing in preference to another one? What makes them please to do this and not do that? Is there no because to their pleasing and wanting? The master can chance these pleases and wants into others as the opposite end of the mental pole. He is able to will instead of to will because some feeling, mood, emotion, or environmental suggestion arouses a tendency or desire within him so to do. The majority of people are carried along like the falling stones, obedient to environment, outside influences, and internal moods, desires, etc. Not to speak of the desires and wills of others, stronger than themselves. Heredity, environment, and suggestions carry them along without resistance on their part or the exercise of their will. Moved like the pawns on the checkered board of life, they play their parts and are laid aside after the game is over. But the masters, knowing the rule of the game, rise above the plane of material life and placing themselves in touch with the higher powers of their nature, dominate their own moods, characters, qualities, and polarity, as well as the environment surrounding them, and thus become movers in the game instead of pawns, causes instead of effects. The masters do not escape the causation of the higher planes, but fall in with the higher laws, and thus master circumstances on the lower plane. They thus form a conscious part of the law, instead of being mere blind instruments. While they serve on the higher planes, they rule on the material plane. But on higher and on lower, the law is always in operation. There is no such thing as chance. The blind goddess has abolished by reason. We are able to see now, with eyes made clear by knowledge, that everything is governed by universal law, that the infinite number of laws are but manifestations of the one great law, the law which is the all. It is true, indeed, that not a sparrow drops unnoticed by the mind of the all, that even the hairs on our head are numbered, as the scriptures have said. There is nothing outside of law, nothing that happens contrary to it, and yet do not make the mistake of supposing that man is but a blind automation. Far from that. The Hermetic teachings are that man may use law to overcome laws, and that the higher will always prevail against the lower, until at last he has reached the stage in which he seeks refuge in the law itself, and laughs the phenomena laws to scorn. Are you able to grasp the inner meaning of this? Chapter 13, Gender. Gender is in everything. Everything has its masculine, feminine principle. Excuse me. Everything has its masculine and feminine principles. Gender manifests on all planes. The KYBALION. The great seventh Hermetic principle, the principle of gender, embodies the truth that there is gender manifested in everything, that the masculine and feminine principles are ever present and active in all phases of phenomena on each and every plane of life. At this point, we think it well to call your attention to the fact that gender in its Hermetic sense and sex in the ordinary accepted use of the term are not the same. The word gender is derived from the Latin root meaning to beget, to procreate, to generate, to create, to produce. A moment's consideration will show you that the word has a much broader and more general meaning than the term sex. The latter referring to the physical distinctions between male and female living things. Sex is merely a manifestation of gender on a certain plane of the great physical plane, the plane of organic life. We wish to impress this distinction upon your minds for the reason that certain writers who have acquired a smattering of the Hermetic philosophy have sought to identify this seven Hermetic principle with wild and fanciful and other reprehensible theories and teachings regarding sex. The office of gender is solely that of creating, producing, generating, etc., and its manifestations are visible on every plane of phenomena. It is somewhat difficult to produce proof of this along scientific lines, for the reason that science has not as of yet recognized this principle as of universal application. But still some proof are forthcoming from scientific sources. In the first place, we find a distinct manifestation of the principle of gender among the corpuscle ions or electrons, which constitutes the basis of matter as science now knows the latter, and which by forming certain combinations form the atom, which until lately was regarded as final and indivisible. The latest word of science is that the atom is composed of a multitude of corpuscles, electrons, and ions, the various names being applied by different authorities, revolving around each other and vibrating at a high degree and intensity. But the accompanying statement is made that the formation of the atom is really due to the clustering of negative corpuscles around a positive one. The positive corpuscles seeming to exert a certain influence upon the negative corpuscles, causing the latter to assume certain combinations and thus create or generate an atom. This is in line with the most ancient Hermetic teachings, which have always identified the masculine principle of gender with the positive and the feminine with the negative poles of electricity, so called. Now a word at this point regarding this identification. The public mind has formed an entirely erroneous impression regarding the qualities of the so-called negative pole of electrified or magnetized matter. The terms positive and negative are very wrongly applied to this phenomena by science. The word positive means something real and strong, as compared with a negative unreality or weakness. Nothing is further from the real facts of electrical phenomena. The so-called negative pole of the battery is really the pole and by which the generation or production of new forms and energy is manifested. There is nothing negative about it. The best scientific authorities now use the word cathode in place of negative. The word cathold coming from the Greek root meaning descent, the path of generation, etc. From the cathold pole emerged the swarm of electrons or corpuscles. From the same pole emerged those wonderful rays, which have revolutionized scientific conceptions during the past decade. The cathold pole is the mother of all of the strange phenomena which have rendered useless the old textbooks and which have caused many long accepted theories to be relegated to the scrap pile of scientific speculation. The cathold or negative pole is the mother principle of electrical phenomena and of the finest forms of matter as yet known to science. So you see, we are justified in refusing to use the term negative, and our consideration of the subject and in insisting upon substituting the word feminine for the old term. The facts of the case bear us out in this, without taking the Hermetic teachings into consideration. And so we shall use the word feminine in place of negative in speaking of that pole of activity. The latest scientific teachings are that the creative corpuscles or electrons are feminine. Science says they are composed of negative electricity. We say they are composed of feminine energy. A feminine corpuscle becomes detached from, or rather leaves, a masculine corpuscle and starts on a new career. It actively seeks a union with a masculine corpuscle, being urged thereto by the natural impulse to create new forms of matter or energy. One writer goes so far as to use the term "it at once seeks, of its own volition, a union," etc. This detachment and uniting form the basis of the greater part of the activities of chemical world. When the feminine corpuscle unites with the masculine corpuscle, a certain process is begun. The feminine particles vibrate rapidly under the influence of the masculine energy and circle rapidly around the latter. The result is the birth of a new atom. This new atom is really composed of a union of the masculine and feminine electrons or corpuscles, but when the union is formed, the atom is a separate thing, having certain properties, but no longer manifesting the property of free electricity. The process of detachment or separation of the feminine electrons, of the feminine electrons is called ionization. These electrons or corpuscles are the most active workers in nature's field. Arising from their unions are combinations, manifest in varied phenomena of light, heat, electricity, magnetism, attraction, repulsion, chemical affinity, and the reverse, and similar phenomena. And all this arises from the operation of the principle of gender on the plane of energy. The part of the masculine principle to be that of directing a certain inherent energy towards the feminine principle, and thus starting into activity the creative process. But the feminine principle is the one always doing the active creative work, and this is so on all planes. And yet each principle is incapable of operative energy without the assistance of the other. In some of the forms of life, the two principles are combined in one organism. For that matter, everything in the organic world manifests both genders. There is always the masculine present in the feminine form, and the feminine form. The Hermetic teachings include much regarding the operations of the two principles of gender and the reproduction and manifestation of various forms of energy, etc. But we do not deem it expedient to go into detail regarding the same at this point, because we are unable to back up the same with scientific proof, for the reason that science has not as yet progressed thus far. But the example we have given you of the phenomena of the electrons or corpuscles will show you that science is on the right path, and will also give you a general idea of the underlying principles. Some leading scientific investigators have announced their belief that in the formation of crystals there was to be found something that corresponds to sex activity, which is another straw showing the direction the scientific winds are blowing. And each year will bring other facts to corroborate the correctness of the Hermetic principle of gender. It will corroborate the correction. Going back reading. And each year will bring other facts to corroborate the correctness of the Hermetic principle of gender. It will be found that the gender is in constant operation and manifestation in the field of inorganic matter and in the field of energy or force. Electricity is now generally regarded as the something into which all other forms of energy seem to melt or dissolve. The electrical theory of the universe is that the latest scientific doctrine, and it's growing rapidly in popularity and general acceptance. And it is thus follows that if we are able to discover the phenomena of electricity, even at the very root and source of its manifestations, a clear and unmistakable evidence of the presence of gender in its activities, we are justified in asking you to believe that science at last has offered proof of the existence in all universal phenomena of that great Hermetic principle, the principle of gender. It is not necessary to take up your time with the well-known phenomena of the attraction and repulsion of the atom's chemical affinity, the loves and hates of the atomic particles, the attraction or cohesion between the molecules of matter. These facts are too well known to need extended comments from us. But have you ever considered that all of these are manifestations of the gender principle? Can you not see that the phenomena is on all fours with that of the corpuscles or electrons? And more than this, can you not see the reasonableness of the Hermetic teachings which assert that the very law of gravitation, that the strange attraction by reason of which all particles and bodies of matter in the universe tend toward each other, is but another manifestation of the principle of gender, which operates in the direction of attracting the masculine to the feminine energies and vice versa? We cannot offer you scientific proof of this at this time, but examine the phenomena in the light of the Hermetic teachings on the subject, and see if you have not a better working hypothesis than any offered by physical science. Submit all physical phenomena to the test, and you will discern the principle of gender ever in evidence. Let us now pass on to a consideration of the operation of the principle of the mental plane. Many interesting features, and their awaiting examination. Turning the page. Page 88. Chapter 14. Right? Mental gender. Students of psychology who follow the modern trend of thought along the lines of mental phenomena are struck by the persistence of the dual mind idea, which has manifested itself so strongly during the past 10 or 15 years, and which has given rise to a number of plausible theories regarding the nature and constitution of these two minds. The late Thompson J. Hudson attained great popularity in 1893 by advancing his well-known theory of the objective and subjective minds, which he held existed in every individual. Other writers have attracted almost equal attention by theories regarding the conscious and subconscious minds, the voluntary and involuntary minds, the active and passive minds, etc., etc. The theories of the various writers differ from each other, but there remains the underlying principle of the duality of mind. The student of the Hermetic philosophy is tempted to smile when he reads and hears of these many new theories regarding the duality of mind, each school adhering tenaciously to its own pet theories, and each claiming to have discovered the truth. The student turns back the pages of occult history, and away back in the dim beginning of occult teachings, he finds reference to the ancient Hermetic doctrine of the principle of gender on the mental plane, the manifestation of mental gender. And examining further, he finds that the ancient philosophy took cognizance of the phenomena of the dual mind and accounted for it by the theory of mental gender. This idea of mental gender may be explained in a few words to the students who are familiar with the modern theories just alluded to. The masculine principle of mind corresponds to the so-called objective mind, conscious mind, voluntary mind, active mind, etc. And the feminine principle of mind corresponds to the so-called subjective mind, subconscious mind, involuntary mind, passive mind, etc. Of course, the Hermetic teachings do not agree with the many modern theories regarding the nature of the two phases of mind, nor does it admit many of the facts claimed for the two respective aspects. Some of the said theories and claims, being very far-fetched and incapable of standing the test of experiment and demonstration, we point to the phases of agreement merely for the purpose of helping the student to assimilate his previously acquired knowledge with the teachings of the Hermetic philosophy. Students of the Hudson will notice that the statement at the beginning of his second chapter of the law of the law of psychic phenomena, that the mystic jargon of the Hermetic philosophers discloses the same general idea, i.e., duality of mind. If Dr. Hudson had taken the time and trouble to decipher a little of the mystic jargon of the Hermetic philosophy, he might have received much light upon the subject of the dual mind. But then perhaps his most interesting work might not have been written. Let us now consider the Hermetic teachings regarding the mental gender. The Hermetic teachers impart their instruction regarding this subject by bidding their students examine the report of their consciousness regarding their self. The students are bidden to turn their attention inward upon the self dwelling within each. Each student is led to see that his consciousness gives him first a report of the existence of his self. The report is, I am. This at first seems to be the final words from the consciousness, but a little further examination discloses the fact that this I am may be separated or split into two distinct parts or aspects, which while working in unison and in conjunction, yet nevertheless may be separated in consciousness. While at first there seems to be only an I existing, a more careful and closer examination reveals that fact that there exists an I and a me. These mental twins differ in their characteristics and nature, and an examination of their nature and turning the page. Page 90, back reading. These mental twins differ in their characteristics and nature, and an examination of their nature and the phenomena arising from the same will throw much light upon many of the problems of mental influence. Let us begin with a consideration of the me, which is usually mistaken for the I by the student until he presses the inquiry a little further back into the recesses of consciousness. A man thinks of himself and its aspects of me as being composed of certain feelings, tastes, likes, dislikes, habits, peculiar ties, characteristics, etc., all of which go to make up his personality or the self known to himself and others. He knows that these emotions and feelings change, are born and die away, are subject to the principle of rhythm and the principle of polarity, which takes him from one extreme of feelings to another. He also thinks of the me as being certain knowledge gathered together in his mind, and thus forming a part of himself. Thus is the me of a man. But we have proceeded too hastily. The me of many men may be said to consist largely of their consciousness of the body and their physical appetites, etc., their consciousness being largely bound up with their bodily nature. They particularly live there. Some men even go so far as to regard their personal apparel as a part of their me, and actually seems to consider it a part of themselves. A writer has harmoniously said that men consist of three parts: soul, body, and clothes. These clothes conscious people would lose their personality if divested of their clothing by savages upon the occasion of a shipwreck. But even many who are not so closely bound up by the idea of personal raiment stick closely to the consciousness of their bodies being their me. They cannot conceive of a self independent of the body. Their mind seems to them to be practically a something belonging to their body, which is many cases it is indeed. But as man rises in the scale of consciousness, he is able to disentangle his me from his idea of body, and is able to think of his body as belonging to the mental part of him. But even then, he is very apt to identifying the me entirely with the mental states, feelings, etc., which he feels to exist within him. He is very apt to consider these internal states as identical with himself, instead of their being simply things produced by some part of his mentality, and existing within him, of him, and in him, but still not himself. He sees that he may change these. Something's wrong. I'm not charging. There we go. Sorry guys, I was not charging. In fact, let's end it at the end of page 90 and come back to a part 10, which will conclude our book read for the KYBALION. So at the end of page 90, we're back reading. But as a man rises in the scales of consciousness, he is able to disentangle his me from his idea of body, and is able to think of his body as belonging to the mental part of him. But even then, he is very apt to identify the me entirely with the mental states, feeling, etc., which he feels to exist within him. He is very apt to consider these internal states as identical with himself, instead of their being simply things produced by some part of his mentality, and existing within him, of him, and in him, but still not himself. Stay tuned for part 10, page 91.